We had cataloged 10,000 civilizations before humanity, and every one of them had broken in the same three ways. They knelt, they bargained, or they burned. That truth was etched into the crystalline archives of the Aliencouncil, where I served as senior chronicler, observer of patterns, recorder of inevitabilities. I had watched empires rise like brief flares and fade into archival footnotes. Species that once believed themselves eternal, reduced to genetic samples and cautionary remarks. When the automated sensors announced a new starfaring civilization from a yellow star on the galactic fringe, I prepared another familiar entry. Then I saw the humans. Their first contact transmissions were irritating, loud, overlapping, chaotic. They did not open with reverence or apology. They asked questions before permissions were granted. They corrected translation errors mid-sentence. One of them laughed, a sharp, uncontained sound, when a junior envoy mispronounced their planetary designation. Laughed. I replayed the footage several times, certain I had misinterpreted a stress response. But no, the human had found the moment amusing. Their ships arrived soon after, ungainly constructs of layered alloys and exposed modular systems. No flowing bioarchitecture, no harmonic shielding, just brutal geometry and redundant plating. By all aesthetic and efficiency metrics, they were crude. And yet they tore through hyperspace with alarming speed, engines screaming like wounded beasts that refused to die. From the council chamber's observation spires, we watched them assemble at the edge of recognized space, not in a tight defensive formation, but scattered, adaptable, as if expecting violence and welcoming it. That was when unease first coiled in my thorax. As historian, my duty was to observe, not judge. Emotion had no place in the archive. Still, the longer I studied humanity, the more they resisted categorization. Newly contacted species were usually overwhelmed by scale, by the vastness of galactic civilization, and their own sudden insignificance. Humans showed no such paralysis. They debated council protocol openly. They questioned why certain species held permanent authority. They requested access to historical data we had never shared with first contact races. And when those requests were denied, they did not protest. They noted it. Even more disturbing were the stories they told about themselves. Not myths of divine origin or manifest destiny, but records, raw and unpolished, of extinction events narrowly survived. Plagues, planetary climate collapse, global wars fought with weapons capable of ending their species entirely. They spoke of these things without shame. Survival, to humans, was not a miracle bestowed by fate or elder powers. It was a habit, an expectation forged through repeated failure and stubborn continuation. Within the council, consensus formed quickly, too quickly. Naive mammals, one elder declared, mandibles clicking in dismissal. They will make excellent labor assets, another suggested. Frontier troops, resource extractors, expendable allies. I recorded these conclusions faithfully, my data crystals glowing as they absorbed yet another judgment passed upon a younger species. Procedure demanded neutrality, and I obeyed. But as I finalized the entry, my sensory spines prickled with a sensation I could not annotate. Dread. Because I realized with quiet clarity that humanity had not come to the galaxy seeking permission. They had come seeking context. And whatever conclusions they reached would not be shaped by fear. As the council prepared its formal response, polite, measured, and edged with unspoken authority, I archived my report and sealed it with the traditional mark of completion. Only later would I understand the truth, that this was not a routine first contact, not the beginning of assimilation or submission. It was the opening whisper of a storm forming just beyond the galactic rim, and moving steadily inward. Power in the galaxy was never built on cruelty. That was the comforting lie we told ourselves. True power, council power, rested on precedent, on the quiet understanding that what had always been done would always be done again. We did not conquer through fire unless required. We did not enslave openly. We structured, we regulated. We collected what we called contributions, a word polished smooth by millennia of use. Resources, military service, territory along unstable borders. Newly contacted species paid their share, and in return they received protection from pirates, from rivals, and most importantly, from us. Those who refused were not destroyed publicly. They simply disappeared. Trade routes adjusted, records amended. Silence filled the space where they had once existed. It was efficient, civilized. Humanity was offered the same arrangement. I remember the chamber clearly on that cycle, the soft bioluminescence of the ceiling panels, the faint hum of translators syncing neural patterns. The council was relaxed. Some elders barely bothered to conceal their boredom. This was procedure, nothing more. The human delegation stood before us, upright, unbowed. Their primary representative listened without interruption as the terms were explained. Protection in exchange for compliance, a modest initial contribution, scaled upward over time, permanent council oversight. When the envoy finished, the human did something unexpected. He asked for clarification. Not in protest, not in outrage. He asked precise questions about definitions, limits, enforcement mechanisms. He requested statistical outcomes from prior protected species. He asked what recourse existed if the council failed its obligations. The chamber stirred with faint irritation. Then he requested time. Time? An elder echoed, incredulous. Yes, the human replied calmly. Governments, plural. I felt the first true flicker of unease then. Most species begged for mercy or rushed to agree, terrified that hesitation itself might be interpreted as defiance. Humans did neither. They treated the council's offer not as a decree, but as a proposal. Days passed. No response. Within the council, patience thinned. Silence was a familiar prelude to capitulation. It always had been. I recorded the shifting mood faithfully, the way language and internal communications hardened, how phrases like mutual benefit gave way to expected obligation. Diplomacy shaded into warning. Warning edged toward threat. I noted it all, my role unchanged, though attention coiled tighter with every cycle. History, after all, had taught me that true disasters rarely began with hatred. They began with certainty, with the belief that the other side had no real choice. When humanity's silence stretched beyond what the council deemed respectful, the ultimatum was authorized. It was delivered with ceremonial gravity, full authority invoked, compliance demanded within a fixed temporal window, consequences outlined, economic isolation, restricted travel, eventual corrective action. The chamber was silent as the transmission ended, satisfied, confident. None of the elders questioned whether the concept of authority itself depended on recognition. None considered that precedent only held power over those who accepted it. As I sealed the archival record of the ultimatum, I hesitated, just for a fraction of a cycle. A thought intruded, unwelcome and persistent. What if humanity was not silent because it was afraid? What if it was preparing an answer that did not fit into any category we had ever recorded? The council awaited submission. I awaited history. And somewhere beyond our jurisdictional borders, a species born on a hostile world was deciding how it would respond, not as subjects, but as equals. The next transmission would make that distinction painfully clear. Humanity's response did not arrive with urgency. That alone unsettled the chamber. When the transmission finally activated, there was no dramatic entrance, no symbolic display of submission or defiance. The human representative appeared exactly as before, still, composed, eyes steady. No raised voice, no visible anger, not even resentment. He began by thanking the council. The words rippled through the chamber in faint confusion. He thanked us for our interest in humanity's future. He acknowledged, with unsettling clarity, the risks of isolation beyond council protection. He admitted, openly, that defying precedent carried consequences. Then, without pause, he refused every demand. Not negotiated, not delayed, refused. The translator confirmed the phrasing 3 times. Absolute denial, no counteroffer. A murmur spread among the elders, irritation sharpening into something colder. But before any interruption could be issued, the human continued. What followed was not a speech. It was testimony. They displayed records, unfiltered, chronological,
brutal. Wars fought across their planet's surface, empires risen and erased within centuries, plagues that had culled billions, weapons built by their own hands that had nearly ended them all. Visuals scrolled beside the speaker, each more devastating than the last. They did not frame these events as triumphs, they framed them as lessons. Extortion, the human said calmly, is not new to us. I felt a chill run along my neural lattice. Species usually erased such memories, too painful, too destabilizing. Humans preserved theirs, studied them. He explained, without accusation, that humanity had learned a singular truth through repetition. Submission does not end predation, it encourages it. The chamber grew quiet. Then came the shockwave. Humanity revealed that while the council debated timelines and consequences, they had acted.
Trade networks had already been realigned beyond council oversight. Mutual defense agreements, informal but binding, had been established with non-aligned systems. Autonomous deterrent platforms had been deployed along approaches to human space, positioned deliberately outside recognized jurisdiction. All enacted. Already. They had not waited for permission. They had not assumed goodwill. They had planned for rejection as the most likely outcome. For the first time in my tenure as chronicler, the council chamber fell completely silent. Not in outrage, in calculation. I observed mandibles still, tendrils retract, ocular clusters narrow as probabilities were recalculated in real time. The elders were no longer deciding how to discipline a lesser species. They were reassessing risk. The human concluded simply, humanity would not accept extortion. They would not initiate aggression, but they would respond to it with unity, with memory, and with force if required. The transmission ended. No flourish, no fret, just certainty. As silence stretched, I understood what the data alone could not convey. Humanity had not arrived at the galactic hierarchy as prey seeking shelter beneath an ancient structure. They had arrived as a variable, unpredictable, uncooperative, prepared. I recorded the session with trembling precision, knowing the archive now contained something unprecedented. The moment the council realized its authority depended not on tradition, but on consent. And consent, once withdrawn, was not easily reclaimed. The elders began to speak again, quietly, urgently, but I barely registered their words. My focus lingered on a single realization, heavy and unavoidable. We had attempted to extort a species that had already survived far worse than us, and in doing so, we had announced ourselves, not as protectors, but as the next challenge humanity would learn to endure. The council responded as it always had, not with open war, but with correction. Sanctions were enacted quietly, encoded as regulatory adjustments. Hyperspace access narrowed. Proxy forces were encouraged to test borders humanity had only recently claimed. It was a familiar pattern, refined over ages. Pressure would build, panic would follow, compliance would come soon after. We expected collapse within cycles. Instead, the reports became confusing. Human supply chains did not fracture, they shifted. Entire logistical networks rerouted through non-aligned systems in spans that defied our models. Civilian industries converted to military production with terrifying speed, factories retooled almost overnight. Their fleets abandoned conventional formations and reappeared as dispersed, unpredictable swarms, designed not to dominate space, but to deny it. Every projection I maintained began to fail. Crisis, to humanity, was not catastrophe. It was catalyst. Only then did we begin to understand our error. Humans were a death world species. They had evolved beneath crushing gravity, volatile climates, and constant biological threat. Their history was not one of stability, but survival under pressure, from predators, from nature, from their own internal divisions. Pressure did not weaken them. It focused them. Each sanction hardened their resolve. Each attack sharpened their doctrine. Losses were absorbed, analyzed, and repaid with precision. Humanity did not ask when the suffering would end. They asked how to endure longer than their adversary. As I archived report after report, A weight settled deep within my chest cavity. This was no longer a matter of council authority or enforcement. We had misjudged the species entirely. We had assumed pressure would bend them. Instead, we were forging something far more dangerous, a civilization that learned, adapted, and advanced fastest when pushed to the brink. And the data suggested a conclusion I did not yet dare to voice. The harder the council pressed, the more formidable humanity became. The First Fleet did not alarm us. Losses occurred on the frontier with predictable regularity: pirates, navigation failures, the occasional miscalculation against an unruly client species. When the report arrived stating that a council patrol group had been neutralized near human-controlled space, it was filed as an anomaly, an unfortunate convergence of chance and inexperience. The second loss unsettled analysts, but not the elders. Tactical error, they declared. Only after the Third Fleet failed to return did silence begin to spread through the council chamber like a slow infection. I was present when the confirmations arrived. No distress calls, no debris fields consistent with chaotic retreat. Human engagements were disturbingly clean, decisive, contained, and final. Their fleets did not pursue fleeing vessels. They did not claim territory. They erased the threat and withdrew. That distinction mattered. Council doctrine was built on domination, territory controlled, populations subdued. Humans did none of this. They fought with a singular purpose: to ensure that whatever had challenged them would never do so again. Captured communications confirmed it. Fragments of human tactical exchanges were recovered from encrypted channels, pieced together with effort and no small amount of fear. The phrase repeated across multiple engagements, spoken in different voices, different languages. Not a rallying cry, not propaganda. A vow. Those words echoed through the council halls long after the recordings ended. Elder species who had once crushed rebellions without hesitation now spoke in lowered tones. Some suggested restraint, temporary de-escalation, revised terms, diplomatic overtures framed as mutual concern. Others reacted with fury. This defiance cannot be tolerated, they argued. Precedent. That word, once our shield, now felt brittle in my thoughts. Debate fractured the chamber. Where there had once been unity, uncertainty took root. Every new report from the frontier arrived heavier than the last, filled with impossible numbers and after-action analyses that ended with the same conclusion. Humanity was learning faster than we could adapt, and they were not slowing down. As chronicler, I continued to record faithfully, but privately, I felt something dangerous stir within me, something I had never experienced while documenting the rise and fall of lesser species. Respect. Humanity did not glorify battle. They did not celebrate victory. Their communications spoke instead of prevention, of lines that must never be crossed again. They fought not for expansion, but for closure, to end the cycle. I realized then why fear had entered the chamber so quietly. It was not because the council faced defeat, at least not yet. It was because we faced an enemy that did not desire what we could offer, did not fear what we threatened, and did not measure success by survival alone. Humanity measured success by the absence of future danger. As the session adjourned in uneasy disarray, I remained behind, reviewing projections that no longer converged on victory. One probability curve stood apart from the rest, rising steadily despite every sanction and strike. A future in which the council's authority did not end in fire, but in irrelevance. And for the first time since I took my oath as historian, I wondered whether I was witnessing not the decline of a reckless species, but the beginning of something the galaxy had never prepared itself to face.
The line appeared first as a statement, not a threat, not a negotiation, a declaration transmitted across open channels, repeated without embellishment, without ceremony. Humanity identified a series of outer systems, industrial hubs, civilian colonies, evacuation corridors, and marked them as inviolable. Beyond that boundary, they would maneuver, contest, endure. Across it, they would not retreat. The council debated the message for less than a cycle. Lines, after all, were meant to be tested. The decision to cross it was framed as necessity, a calibrated incursion, limited force to reassert authority and shatter human resolve before their confidence could spread further. Strategists assured the elders that no species could absorb sustained losses at the frontier and maintain cohesion. History, they argued, was on our side. The first Council task force entered human-designated space at the edge of a dying star system, a place chosen deliberately, far from core worlds, far from witnesses who might distort the narrative. I observed from the archive spire as tactical feeds bloomed across the chamber. What followed did not resemble battle. It was a demonstration. Human defensive formations did not attempt to repel the initial strike, they absorbed it. Entire squadrons were lost in the opening exchange, ships reduced to expanding clouds of incandescent debris. Against any other species, such losses would have triggered retreat, panic, collapse of command. Human channels remained steady. No cries of outrage, no frantic appeals, only acknowledgments, rerouting orders, calm confirmations of casualty figures that climbed with horrifying speed. Then they moved. Human vessels emerged from concealment vectors our models had dismissed as inefficient. Their formations fractured and reformed mid-engagement, sacrificing units deliberately to expose Council firing patterns. They closed distance without hesitation, knowing precisely how much punishment their hulls and their crews could endure. Losses mounted on both sides. The difference lay in response. Council forces hesitated when thresholds were crossed, when damage exceeded acceptable margins, when projections dipped below survivability standards. Human forces did not. They advanced into conditions that would have broken other species' morale, pressing forward not because success was guaranteed, but because withdrawal was unacceptable.
I watched human soldiers board a crippled Council cruiser under sustained fire, sealing breaches with their own bodies long enough for others to pass. Their life signs vanished one by one, yet the assault continued, relentless and methodical. They fought knowing they might die, and choosing to stand anyway. That was when I understood what we had failed to calculate. Resilience, for humanity, was not doctrine, it was inheritance. They had evolved on a world where survival was never assured, where storms erased cities, where predators hunted their young, where scarcity and violence were not anomalies, but constants. Their history had taught them that endurance was not heroic, it was required. As the engagement reached its turning point, the Council fleet attempted withdrawal. Human forces did not pursue beyond the marked boundary, they did not press advantage, they allowed the survivors to escape, damaged and shaken, carrying data we could not censor. The message was unmistakable. This line was not a bluff. When the final tactical feed faded, the Council chamber remained frozen in stunned quiet. Analysts stared at casualty reports that defied interpretation. Loss ratios alone could not explain what we had witnessed. By all strategic logic, humanity should have broken first. They had not broken at all. They had endured, and then dictated the terms of disengagement. I archived the encounter with trembling precision, aware that the data alone would not convey its significance. The truth was more unsettling than numbers could express. Humanity had demonstrated that there existed a point beyond which they would no longer calculate survival, beyond which they would simply stand. As emergency sessions were convened and voices rose in renewed argument, my thoughts lingered on the boundary humanity had drawn and the ease with which we had dismissed it. The Council believed the line marked the limit of human tolerance. I feared it marked something else entirely, a threshold. And if crossed again, I suspected the next demonstration would not end with restraint, but with a response the galaxy would never forget. The shift did not begin with declarations. It began with silence. Trade lanes once regulated by Council edict grew uncertain. Ships from neutral systems delayed filings. Diplomatic envoys canceled routine appearances. Minor client species began rerouting communications through human relay networks, unofficial at first, then openly.
No announcement marked the change, yet every data stream told the same story. The galaxy was watching. Humanity did not broadcast conquest or promise liberation. They made no grand speeches. Instead, they offered something disturbingly simple: partnership without tribute, protection without chains, agreements that could be exited without punishment. To many worlds long accustomed to paying for their own survival, this was not rebellion, it was hope. I reviewed transcripts of first contacts between human diplomats and neutral species. There was no demand for loyalty, no insistence on ideological alignment, only transparency. shared defense parameters, mutual aid clauses written in language that assumed equality rather than obedience. Systems began to defect quietly, not entire civilizations at first, just shipping consortia, research enclaves, outer colonies, enough to matter, enough to strain council enforcement mechanisms that depended on compliance, not compulsion. Each departure was minor in isolation. Together, they formed a fracture. Within the council chamber, the response was confusion bordering on disbelief. This violates protocol, one elder insisted. Protocol, however, required consent. For the first time in recorded history, that consent was being withdrawn en masse. Power, true power, was no longer flowing downward through decrees and sanctions. It was moving upward, shaped by the choices of those once governed. I felt a strange vertigo as I updated the archives. Every previous rebellion we had recorded followed the same arc: defiance, suppression, erasure. This was different. There was no single uprising to crush, no capital world to target. There was only choice. The more the council threatened, the faster neutral systems leaned away. Human networks absorbed the strain with remarkable adaptability, expanding not through coercion but invitation. They did not promise safety, they promised effort. That distinction mattered deeply to species raised under council rule. Humanity did not claim to be benevolent overlords. They presented themselves as allies who would stand and endure alongside others. I realized then that what we were witnessing was not the collapse of authority through violence, it was the erosion of legitimacy. The elders debated harsher measures, but each proposal carried escalating risk. Strike too hard and more systems would flee. Do nothing and the exodus would continue.
For the first time, the council was trapped by its own precedent. As chronicler, I had been trained to recognize rebellion. This was not rebellion. This was evolution. A galaxy learning, painfully and unevenly, that power derived from consent could not be reclaimed by force alone. Humanity had not overturned the old order with weapons. They had revealed an alternative. As the session adjourned and the chamber lights dimmed, I lingered over a projection that showed influence lines redrawing themselves across the stars, fluid, decentralized, impossible to command from a single throne. I understood then that the Council's greatest fear was no longer defeat, it was obsolescence. And somewhere within human-controlled space, new alliances were forming, not around dominance, but around shared endurance. The tide had turned, and no edict remained that could force it back. Defeat approached the Council quietly, not as annihilation, not as conquest, as irrelevance. The projections made it impossible to deny. Military escalation would not restore authority, it would accelerate defection. Economic pressure had lost its teeth. Sanctions no longer isolated targets, they pushed them toward human networks that grew stronger with every attempt to weaken them. For the first time in its long history, the Council faced an adversary it could not dominate without destroying the very system it claimed to preserve. Humanity did not seek our seats. They did not demand representation or tribute in reverse. They made no attempt to replace the Council with their own hierarchy. Their communications were precise, restrained, and consistent. Extortion, they stated, was incompatible with stability. That single assertion undermined everything the Council had been built upon. Emergency sessions followed in rapid succession. Elders argued with a desperation I had never recorded before. Some called for decisive force, a final demonstration meant to remind the galaxy who still held the largest fleets. Others warned that such action would only confirm humanity's claims and drive the remaining neutral systems away. Fear shaped every exchange. Not fear of human weapons, but fear of becoming unnecessary. I observed as once immovable figures questioned doctrines they had enforced for millennia. What good was authority if no accepted it? What was power if it required constant threat to maintain? The answer, unspoken but understood, was unbearable. The Council voted. Not unanimously, not proudly.
They chose survival of relevance over pride. A peace delegation was authorized. Language was revised carefully. No admission of wrongdoing, no apology that might fracture internal cohesion. The transmission would frame negotiations as a mutual reassessment of galactic governance. Even so, the meaning was unmistakable. The Council was suing for peace. As I archived the decision, my appendages trembled. I had documented countless treaties imposed upon the defeated. Never had I recorded one requested by the dominant power. The irony was impossible to ignore. Humanity had not shattered the Council through war. They had forced it to confront a truth long buried beneath tradition, Authority without consent is only coercion, and coercion fails once fear stops working. The delegation departed under escort, carrying terms that would have been unthinkable cycles earlier: transparency, voluntary participation, an end to compulsory contributions. Whether humanity would accept remained unknown. As the chamber emptied, I lingered alone, gazing at the star map where influence lines continued to shift despite the Council's decision. Peace, I realized, was not the end of conflict. It was an admission, an acknowledgement that the galaxy had changed, and that those who refused to change with it would be left behind. The Council had made its choice. Now, all that remained was to see whether humanity would allow us to live with it. Humanity's response to the peace request arrived faster than expected. There was no delay for internal debate, no posturing, no attempt to extract advantage from the Council's moment of weakness. The transmission opened with a familiar human envoy, older now, marked by fatigue rather than triumph. He did not smile. The chamber tensed. We expected demands, reparations calculated across centuries, territorial concessions, public acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Such terms were standard when power shifted hands. Humanity requested none of them. Their terms were simple: transparency in all interstellar governance, open records, shared oversight, decisions visible to those affected by them, mutual defense, voluntary, collective, and limited to protection, not enforcement, and above all, an end to coercion. No forced contributions, no sanctioned extortion disguised as stability, no vengeance, no punishment. The elders struggled to mask their unease. Mercy, offered without obligation, unsettles those accustomed to fear as currency.
Humanity did not seek to humiliate the Council. They did not demand symbolic submission or the dismantling of our institutions. They demanded restraint. The envoy spoke of survival, not as triumph, but as responsibility. Humanity had learned through catastrophe after catastrophe that cycles of domination always returned to consume their creators. They would not inherit that legacy. "Ended here," he said. The words echoed through the chamber long after the transmission ended. As chronicler, I catalogued the terms with meticulous care. They were not written by conquerors. They were written by survivors, by a species that understood how close existence always was to collapse and how easily power could become addiction. Some elders objected in private. Others whispered that this mercy was merely a prelude to control. But the data offered no support for such fears. Human actions aligned with their words: withdrawals where escalation was possible, restraint where retaliation would have been easy. Their mercy was more unsettling than their wrath. Wrath followed predictable patterns. Mercy forced reflection. As negotiations began, neutral systems watched closely. Many signaled immediate acceptance of the new framework, eager to abandon centuries of tribute. The Council's role shifted almost overnight, from enforcer to coordinator, from authority to participant. I felt a strange weight lift as I updated the archives. For the first time, our records did not describe the end of a civilization or the crushing of defiance. They described a choice. Humanity had won not by destroying us, but by refusing to become us. And that, I realized, was the most dangerous lesson they could have taught the galaxy, because it meant the future would no longer be decided by those who could take the most, but by those who could endure the longest without losing themselves. I record this final entry not as a warning, but as acknowledgement. History for the Council had always been measured in dominion. Empires rose, tributaries bowed, species were catalogued by their obedience or destruction. Humanity altered that narrative. They did not conquer the galaxy. They did not subjugate worlds with fleets, or fear. They forced it to grow up. I watched as systems long accustomed to hierarchy learned to speak, to choose, to act. They weighed decisions not in terms of tribute, but survival. They aligned themselves not with the strongest arm, but with the species that endured and led without breaking those around them. Humanity's example was contagious. The galaxy shifted incrementally, almost imperceptibly at first, until the Council realized that influence had changed direction. Power no longer flowed downward from edict and coercion. It now moved upward, shaped by choice, trust, and respect. Humans taught a lesson the Council could neither legislate nor punish. Survival is not granted by power, it is earned through endurance. Not the endurance of raw strength, but the endurance of will, adaptability, and moral consistency. Each human fleet that stood against overwhelming odds, each colony that refused coercion, each negotiation conducted without manipulation or threat reinforced that truth. As chronicler, I have cataloged countless species, civilizations, and turning points, yet none have compelled me to revise the entire framework of our records so thoroughly. Humanity reshaped not only the political map, but the psychological landscape of the galaxy. They demonstrated that dominance is fragile, but integrity and resilience can become unstoppable forces. I close this entry with a rare sentiment: respect. Humanity's story is not one of conquest. It is a testament to what a species can achieve when it refuses to yield to fear, when it refuses to obey tradition blindly, and when it survives because it must, not because it can. The galaxy will remember them, not for the wars they fought, but for the example they became. And I, as witness and recorder, will remember the moment we understood that a species could endure beyond expectation, and in doing so, redefine what it means to exist.